I get started, I want to thank the University of California at Irvine, as well as all the faculty and staff associated with holding the conference here, as well as my mentor, Professor Sleeper, for allowing me to have this opportunity to present here. So according to the journalists from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times, voter participation in contemporary presidential and congressional elections in the United States are shameful and abysmal. Reporter Scott Martell of the LA Times claimed that the disappointing trends are turning our nation into a democracy of the few. The presidential election of 2008, which pitched charismatic election tickets in Barack Obama and Joe Biden against John McCain and Sarah Palin, fell short of an expected surge in political engagement by the populace. In a poll conducted by the Census Bureau in 2012, about 4 million registered voters refused to vote out of disinterest, doubting the significance of their vote or disliking the candidates. Another 15 million voters that were eligible to participate in the election didn't even bother to participate using the same rationale. While voter apathy does exist, in this presentation, I will argue that the data provided by the United States Census Bureau was misleading, and that factors like plurality systems, discrimination, non-competitive electoral primaries, and governmental disillusionment are far more significant. I will examine major historical events while emphasizing the reforms of the progressive era, demonstrating that it is not voter apathy, but these other factors that are preventing voter turnout. In the past 120 years, the United States Congress has enacted several measures to expand the eligible population of voters. The 14th and 15th Amendments were among the first in the Reconstruction era, granting citizenship and the right to vote to former African American male slaves. Reforms in the progressive era tasked the federal government with regulating votes instead of the parties. Introduced in 1888, the Australian ballot allowed voters to cast their ballot in secrecy, which effectively stripped political machines of their influence on the electorate and prevented large-scale voter fraud. In addition, the progressive era also produced the initiative, referendum, and recall systems in some states, the 17th Amendment that allowed voters to directly elect their senators, and the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote in 1920. Later in the 20th century, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, under the leadership of President Lyndon B. Johnson, outlawed literacy tests and allowed federal examiners to register eligible disfranchised voters, particularly in the South. In 1971, as our entire nation was engulfed in the Vietnam War, the national voting age requirement fell from 21 to 18. All of these measurements were accomplished with the expectation that more voters would come to the polls to cast their ballots. The paradox is that while these improvements in direct democracy encourage a higher overall voter turnout, the opposite has occurred. Despite the implementations of progressive reforms, overall voter turnout in the United States national elections of 1920 and 1924 fell below 50%. After the passage of the 26th Amendment in 1971, the presidential election fell by 6 percentage points compared to the previous election. A concept still debated among experts is whether voter turnout is typically this low. University of Texas professor of political science Walter Dean Burnham once noted that the United States yielded far higher electoral participation between the 1830s and the 1890s. Burnham argued that this was the result of an engaged electorate led by organized and much more competitive political parties. However, Burnham's claim made no mention of the lack of voting regulation during the Gilded Age. Some experts claim that the reforms of the progressives removed incentives used by political machines to convince voters to cast their ballots, such as jobs and government contracts. The reality is that the dramatic decline of participation was the removal of fraudulent votes, the persistent discrimination against minorities, and adjustments to learning new voter registration processes. With these causes in consideration, it is likely that the actual overall voter turnout in American presidential elections from 1830s to the 1890s never rose beyond 65%. While the efforts of the progressivists expanded the eligible population of voters and revealed more authentic voting trends at the national level, there were and still are many governmental policies that discourage those voters from casting their ballots. Since the progressive era, overall voter turnout in national elections has fluctuated, and the causes were diverse. One cause was plurality voting systems, in which a candidate needs only more electoral votes than any other candidate as opposed to an absolute majority of votes in order to win. In 1948, the presidential election saw a decline in voter turnout from 55.9% in 1944 to 52.2%. President Truman was vulnerable in this election because of a divergence in the Democratic Party over the implementation of McCarthyism, as well as segregation in the South. This led the Republican Party to remain confident in their chances of candidate Thomas E. Dewey winning the presidency. Because the emerging third parties in this particular election disrupted the balance of Democratic voters, many voters were convinced that Dewey would win the election regardless of which candidate they chose. President Truman won an unexpected victory in this election because of a brief decline in electoral participation, discrimination from Jim Crow laws, and the absence of Republican voters who believed their candidate had already won. Another major factor to turnout fluctuations is discrimination. Until the passage of the 24th Amendment in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, African Americans in the South who faced struggles of segregation and inequality also faced poll taxes and literacy tests before voting. As expert Bernard Groffman and Lisa Handley noted, it was not until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that African American voter turnout, as well as representation in Southern state legislatures, dramatically increased. A third cause of turnout fluctuations is non-competitive electoral primaries. Since the reforms of primary systems during the Progressive Era, and more recently the introduction of superdelegates in 1984, both of the major parties have experienced primaries disadvantageous to both the voters and the candidates running for office. Unique to the Democratic Party is the use of superdelegates in electoral primaries, who wield a single electoral vote equivalent to thousands of popular votes. Sometimes seen as a nuisance by their popular counterparts, superdelegates serve as an obstruction to competitive primaries for the Democratic Party, oftentimes conserving their support for candidates with congressional experience rather than those supported by a majority of voters. For the Republicans, the use of winner-take-all primaries have, on multiple occasions, given the winning candidate a decisive nomination relatively quickly compared to Democratic races. This is because winner-take-all primaries allow an initially popular candidate to extend his lead by over-representing the number of delegates that support him, which oftentimes prevent other candidates from effectively competing in the primaries. A last major influence on voter turnout is disillusionment. Following the Watergate scandal of the early 1970s, voter turnout at presidential elections experienced declines to an average of about 54%, and did not experience recovery until the election of 2004. The distrust of political representatives by their constituents, especially at the national level, is a lasting legacy of Watergate, and is oftentimes cited as the first of a series of political frustrations between individual voters, political parties, and interest groups. In its ruling in the 2010 case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court placed corporations and unions under the protection of the First Amendment, allowing unlimited political expenditures and the creation of super PACs. The ruling produced widespread criticism from both mainstream and scholarly media, and potentially harsh consequences for future voter turnouts in national elections. Professor Lawrence Lessig of Harvard University warned that the perception of corruption in Congress by voters following the Supreme Court ruling can threaten the democratic institution of the country, and noted that a majority of Americans already feel that congressional representatives are heavily influenced by corporations. This has already seen repercussions in the congressional elections of 2012, which yielded an alarming turnout of only 35.9%, the lowest since 1940 and the fourth lowest in our nation's history. The impacts of Watergate and Citizens United are felt even today, with the anti-establishment and progressive rhetoric of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders surging in popularity among disillusioned and angry voters. It is plurality systems, discrimination, non-competitive primaries, and disillusionment, not voter apathy, which causes the United States to fall short in political participation compared to other developed democracies like Australia, Germany, and the United Kingdom. If turnout rates are to reach those of the 1960s or even the Gilded Age, major reforms must take place to maximize the value of voting and representation, eliminate the factor of discrimination, and encourage more competitive campaigns. A study conducted by Pippa Norris of Harvard University in 2003 concluded that the political institutions established in the United States Constitution not only fail to encourage voter turnout, but actively suppress it. I recommend following two of her most supported conclusions. The first solution is implanting a proportional representative system. In a proportional representative democracy, each citizen that votes has a virtual guarantee that their vote will be represented in a legislative branch of government. This is because the number of legislative seats that a political party holds in a PR system is proportional to the number of votes in favor of their candidates. For instance, if 10% of the nation's voter-eligible population voted for one party in a legislative body, then 10% of the seats in that legislative body would be held by that party. A proportional representative system values every vote and would discourage gerrymandering from both political parties. Both parties use gerrymandering today to minimize the value of minority voters by isolating them into large districts concentrated with similar political leanings. It is because of this that African American and Latino voters are often underrepresented in proportion to their overall population in the US. If we went to a proportional representative democracy, Norris determined that there would be a gain of approximately 10% more of voter turnout in elections than plurality systems. In addition, countries with proportional systems tend to have multiple parties that give voters more options for representation in the political spectrum. The second solution is to redistrict our electoral districts into even and small constituencies. In a nation as large and diverse as the United States, any potential voter living in a large and densely populated electoral district will have less voting power compared to one living in a small rural setting. As political scientist Robert A. Dahl once noted, smaller populated states in the US have more voting power for citizens per district compared to larger ones, and more political power in the national legislature, particularly in the Senate. Should all electoral districts be made even and small, the incentive to vote for a candidate would drastically increase for each individual voter. A third improvement that must be made is to create competitive primaries. Qualities in the Democratic and Republican primaries are known to be disadvantageous to voters and potential candidates because of the use of super candidates and winner-take-all systems. Superdelegates are often elected officials and party leaders, sometimes vote against the wishes of the popular majority, and can determine the outcome of a close race for the candidacy. Winner-take-all primaries have discouraged Republican voters from voicing their support for less popular candidates, the same effect that plurality voting systems have on presidential and congressional elections. More recently, winner-take-all primaries have subjected the Republican Party to the electoral dominance of certain disliked candidates. The elimination of both practices in American primaries would give voters additional confidence in their voting power and strengthen their support for each political party, as contests for the party's candidate would require the galvanizing of more political participants. A fourth improvement would be to remove voter ID laws. A study in 2015 conducted by the University of California, San Diego concluded that states with recently implemented voter ID laws have experienced significant declines in primary turnouts from eligible Latino, African American, Asian American, and multiracial American voters, and that laws appear to favor conservative parties in both primaries and election turnouts. Removing voter ID laws will reverse the effects already seen by their implementation, encouraging the eligible minority voters to cast their ballots. A fifth and final improvement would be to overrule the Supreme Court decision in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This would not only restore some trust between American voters and their government, but would allow candidates with less financial resources to stand a better chance in congressional and presidential campaigns. The significance of these suggested reforms imply that the United States has one of the least democratic electoral processes of established Western democracies. Whether such reforms should take place, however, remains subject to debate. These are my sources, and that concludes my